name is Maarten van Aalst and I'm director of the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, which is a reference center for the international Red Cross Red Crescent movement on climate change.
Yes, the Red Cross has been active in climate risk assessments and climate risk management. Can you briefly explain how the Red Cross ensures that these assessments are really result in better decisions?
Well, partly it's involving the people that need to take the decisions themselves. So too much of the climate information and of climate risk assessments have been done by outside experts. One of the things we focus on is the dialogues that we need to have with the people in the end making the decisions. And those can be national policymakers, but they can also be local farmers.
Yeah. And how exactly do you work? So you do, for example, vulnerability assessments. You engage in dialogues.
Yeah.
And then once the Red Cross leaves the country, you make sure that these people continue the work that you did.
Yeah, the Red Cross is really not leaving the country in the end. Every country has its own Red Cross or Red Crescent Society, and our local volunteers live in the local villages. So I think that's part of the solution, that we empower our local volunteers all around the world to take up this issue and understand and use those risk assessments locally. At the policy level, clearly this is something that partly needs to be addressed by governments.
Yeah.
So we also bring the information to them. And again, the national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies in each of those countries are in a very good position to work with their own governments to bring the concerns about the most vulnerable people being affected by these changing risks to the fore.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That brings us to the next question. How exactly? What methods do you use to scale up the local pilot studies that you do to make sure that they are integrated into national planning, national decision making? How do you, as people from the Red Cross, may assure this?
Well, I'd say there's two answers. One is that we actually have a global network of volunteers. We have tens of millions of volunteers all around the world in those small villages. Part of it is that we need to find solutions to do these risk assessments that don't rely on me as director of a global reference center or a bunch of PhD researchers to come to a village and do the risk assessment for them. But actually develop the tools that allow all those volunteers around the world to get access to the scientific information and then assess their risks themselves. So that is in our own network. The second is indeed that element of dialogue. And they're in their role as auxiliaries to government in each of those countries. They actually have a mandate already to bring the concerns about the most vulnerable groups to the national policy debates. And we're trying to empower the national societies in each of those countries with the right information to indeed bring the information from the local communities to that national policy level.
Yeah. So until now we talked about the engagement of the Red Cross, staff of the Red Cross with national government or local people, but how about cooperation with traditional donors? And what are the main barriers to the cooperation of Red Cross, of an NGO, an organization like the Red Cross, with traditional donors?
Well, clearly at the level of policy, everyone is now in agreement that we need approaches that work around resilience and bridge gaps between financing for development, for humanitarian response after disasters, and for climate change. In practice, that's still very difficult, and that is one of the challenges that we face. Yeah. Sometimes for us in the Red Cross, it's much easier to get funding after a disaster has happened than to be able to prevent disasters beforehand. We still need to make that shift, and that's one of the challenges, I'd say, at the international donor level.
Yeah, because generally donors, NGOs, they often feel left out of the work that traditional donors do with partner countries.
Yeah, I think it might be slightly less difficult for us as a Red Cross or Crescent with that national presence in each country and also a formal status in the United Nations system. So we have possibly slightly better access than a traditional NGO would. Yeah. But still, I think there's work to be done there. And again, the realities on the ground are not yet translated into the policy and financing mechanisms that we have internationally.
Yeah. Okay, then I guess you're also active in mainstreaming these climate risks into development planning and development policy making. What has until now been the main achievement when it comes to mainstreaming climate risks in developing countries?
Well, for me, the big achievement over the past 10 years has been the increasing convergence of climate change adaptation, which was a separate area of work under the Climate Change Convention internationally, and disaster risk reduction, which was a growing field within development. Yeah. So on the climate change side, people realized we're not going to be able to deal with this problem by just reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Things are changing already, we need to address those risks.
Yeah.
On the disaster side, people realized we cannot just keep responding and reconstructing after the fact. We need to anticipate problems. They were happening in silos. In the past 10 years, they've really come together and are jointly being mainstreamed into regular development planning now.
Yeah.
That's a very important achievement.
Okay, so you can use the lessons learned from disaster management also for climate change adaptation.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And apply some of the climate change adaptation financing to reduce risks that we already face today,
Yeah.
are just getting worse and more uncertain in a changing climate.
Yeah. Okay, so mutually learning from each other. Then when it comes to the European Union, what do you consider the added value that the European Union has in relation to building climate resilience in Africa, specifically for the European Union's work?
Well, I think there's two levels. The one is the European Union as a negotiating power in the International Climate Change Convention,
Yeah.
where I think the EU is still one of the relatively leading donor voices in the debates about what needs to happen in the agreement that we need to make in 2015 in Paris, and which will enter into force in 2020.
Yeah.
So that is one important role. The second, of course, is still being an important ally with the developing countries in Africa in their general development challenges. And I think the EU has played an important role advancing the discussions on resilience.
Yeah.
That's not to say that we're already there. As I said, I still see big gaps between different areas of financing and practice.
Yeah.
And I would hope that we can make further progress in the coming years, particularly putting policy intentions to practice in the field.
Yeah. Okay. And then we arrived at the final question when it comes to Africa, talking from your own experience or experience from your colleagues. Which country is best achieving when it comes to climate risk management, and which African country is doing worse?
Well, it's always difficult to pinpoint to one specific winner and one specific loser.
Or even in terms of regional achievers or less performers.
Well, what really excites me is to see, for instance, in East Africa, the capacity of regional organizations, including the IGET Center for Climate Prediction, ICPAC, working together with stakeholders in those countries to produce climate information and really link it to decisions. So, for instance, Kenya Red Cross had a climate focal point 5 years ago, who is now working in ICPAC, the regional climate science provider, to bridge the gap between climate science and practice in the field. I think those are exciting examples of how things are progressing well. At the same time, we still see challenges with climate information being available about risks that we can see coming in the longer term, but even in the next season ahead, for instance, that are not yet translated into action.
Yeah.
And some of the regions, and well, the Sahel is a classical case, of course, where we see the biggest suffering, but we actually face the biggest uncertainties in terms of what climate change information can tell us about what's going to change.
Yeah, the forecasting. Okay. Thank you very much for your valuable input, and we will not keep you much longer away from your busy agenda.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
Nice to join you.
Thank you very much.